The stories of American bad men have always captivated the hearts and attention of an adoring public. We're all familiar with the exploits of such infamous outlaws of the 1800s, such as John Wesley Hardin, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Billy the Kid, and Jesse and Frank James, as well as the famous long-running feud of the Hatfields and the McCoys. With that being said, allow me to introduce you to the single bloodiest man in the history of all the Kentucky feuds. The story of the terror of eastern Kentucky, Bad Tom Smith.
Tom was one of these people who was a really work in progress. He went from the ambush style of killing, where he would shoot from the tree line, shoot from the woods. The person that he shot probably never truly knew who killed him, to some very up close and personal murders in which he would shoot people's eyes out. That is a huge transformation from the coward that shoots from the tree line to the cold-blooded murderer that would walk up to someone and shoot them at point-blank range. And Tom accomplished that in his lifetime.
Two of the things that really led Tom down the path to damnation was his love of whiskey and his love of women. And by all accounts, the women loved him back. He also was what we would call a clothes horse. He had to be the best dressed guy in the room. He really enjoyed being what's termed a dandy.
A dandy was a term that signified a man who was always properly dressed in the finest of attires and immaculately groomed. Thomas Smith had a penchant for not only fine clothing, but fine women as well. There was never an account where he wasn't reported to have been exceptionally dressed and thoroughly prepared as to be presentable to the young ladies.
Bad Tom was just, he almost seemed like it was like an era of when there was all this happening all over, like in the Wild West. I mean, it always seems like we were the Wild West here in eastern Kentucky. And that's kind of sad, but we still wear those jeans and wear those cowboy hats and sing and dance and drink a little alcohol too.
There were many, many crimes that were laid at his feet. But just like Jesse James, just like many of the outlaws of the Old West, probably not all of them were his doing. The things that he said he had done, the things that we know for a fact that were directly tied to him, some of the details are just horrific.
The history of eastern Kentucky is truly a history of isolation. It was a raw, untamed area of the country that was isolated by the treacherous Appalachian mountain range, and the only way in or out was by way of the Kentucky River. Settlers came there for land and the opportunity to raise a family, while opting to leave the aristocratic societies of Virginia and the eastern seaboard. By the time Bad Tom emerged in the mid-1800s, eastern Kentucky had begun to develop economically. There was an overabundance of both vast coal deposits and seemingly endless acres of virgin timber, which promised boundless opportunities for thriving new industry.
But there was a certain thing that came together just at the time that Bad Tom is born in 1859. You start to see this huge interest in developing eastern Kentucky. Certainly, Tom was not living in a vacuum. He lived in the culture of Knott County. He lived in the culture of Perry County in his early developmental days.
There were several factors following the Civil War that influenced the life and times of Thomas Smith. Not only was there the customary baby boom that naturally accompanied war, but also the availability of cheap moonshine whiskey in the area, and a surplus of easily affordable firearms flooding an already eager market. Thereby, he grew up in a society that was literally based on women, whiskey, and cheap weapons. Thomas Smith was born into very humble circumstances to a very prominent family in Perry County, Kentucky in 1859. His father, Richard, was highly influential in the troublesome Creek community of Pigeon Roost. He had been a minister and the grandson of one of the largest property owners in the area. Tragically, he was murdered when Tom was only 5 years old.
Tom was orphaned early in his life. His father was pretty much killed in front of him, and his mother died not long after that. He was sent off to live with family members, various family members from county to county, along with his brother Bill, who was 3 years older. His sisters were sent to other parts of the family.
Tom was one of those people who really went along with the crowd. From everything that I've read and family accounts, he really was a follower. That probably got him into some early trouble. That probably got him into running with the wrong crowd in his teenage years. That got him into some stealing issues in his early teenage years. And that leads him to these situations where he is susceptible to powerful men who are leaders, who are willing to kind of give direction to young boys who need direction. And that leads him directly to Ballard Fulton French.
One of the most famous feuds in eastern Kentucky was the French-Eversole feud, which transpired in Perry County and primarily in the city of Hazard. This was a power, influence, and control feud, which raged between two political factions that recruited young, impressionable men and teenage boys to carry out attacks on members of the opposite faction. It was a war of attrition. Elimination of the enemy resulted in monopolized control of local industry.
And French Eversole really comes down to those two powerful men. The Eversole family had run the county for many years. Suddenly you get this challenge from a man by the name of Ballard Fulton French, B.F. French as he was known, and as a result, basically an all-out civil war breaks out in Perry County.
B.F. French, or more commonly known as Fulton or Fulton French, he was a fellow who came into Hazard from North Carolina, and he was, at the time, an attorney. When he came into Hazard, he also opened a mercantile business and tried to fit in as best as he possibly could, from what I understand. However, he was an outsider.
French was a very powerful merchant in Hazard. He was looking for men to protect his interest. So you start to get folks like Bad Tom or Tom Smith, and you start to get folks like Jess Fields, who's a very prominent individual in the Fulton French faction. And these men would basically work for their benefactors.
As the owner of a thriving mercantile, Fulton French would have been able to supply his men with the most up-to-date weaponry, the finest clothing, and the strongest whiskey that money could buy. As an up-and-coming protege to Fulton, Tom would certainly have all of this, along with prime exposure to the young ladies.
So the women really liked Tom because he was a good-looking man by all accounts. We have several instances where people would tell us that had witnessed Tom or knew Tom that he was an absolutely good-looking man with flawless skin, a fellow who had a bright smile, but yet at the same time, when he turned angry, these dark lines appeared in his forehead, in his face. So we know a little bit about what Tom looked like, and certainly the women liked him.
Joe Eversole was a young lawyer in this town, and as an attorney, he realized that a lot of the people were just getting cheated, and they thought they were doing something good, and they were getting double talked into selling their land, selling the minerals on their land. Joe Eversole proceeded to try to convince people that they needed to be more careful.
He was also an attorney, and interestingly enough, he was also in the mercantile business. And as far as Joe Eversole was concerned, he and Fulton French were friends. He had no idea that Fulton had these designs on basically buying up the mineral rights and land rights and things like that for the railroad that was imminently going to come through.
For a great many years, the only way in or out of the surrounding mountains was by the winding Kentucky River. Traveling by push boats, teams of men would raft floating logs downriver to market to the state capital of Frankfort. However, by the late 1870s, there became a genuine interest in bringing the railroad to eastern Kentucky. The speculation began as to what cities and towns would be economically impacted by this more viable method of transportation.
And when you back up and look at these feuds that are happening right after the Civil War, almost all of them are directly based in this speculation. The chance to make a huge amount of money, and they thought the railroad was going to do that.
Outcroppings of coal were discovered in this area, and the corporations in the north knew how important this area was for the coal that was found here. And long before the railroad ever came, they realized that this was going to be an important part of the country for the resources that were here.
There were lots of people who were trying to take economic control of Breathitt County, of Perry County, and even Knott County, where they thought the train was going to go. So when you back up and look at the history of French Eversole, when you back up and look at the history of Hargis and Markham, all of the feuds of Eastern Kentucky, there is a railroad component behind every single one of those. In the life of Bad Tom Smith, the Eversole French feud really is one of the main central parts of what developed Tom into the murderer that he became.
Now, at the time that Tom was there, downtown Hazard was probably nothing more than just a little shanty-ridden river town, and it was mainly clapboard houses and just things that were thrown up quick. At the best time of the year, the mud was only ankle deep in the streets.
Elections in Eastern Kentucky during this time period were very interesting. They were still stand-up elections for the most part, in which you went to the location. You, at a certain time, the election was held, and everyone who was voting for one side of the faction stood on that side of the room. The other would stand on the other side, and they would take a simple count. So there were no true secret ballots in most of these local elections. There was no real secret of who anybody voted for. So it's not an unusual thing when we find that one of Bad Tom's very first incidents comes at an election, in which Bad Tom shows up. He is, and you had a couple of these bad men who would show up and just go wild at an election precinct, so that people would leave before the vote and weren't able to cast the vote. So Tom was one of these wild people, throwing rocks, screaming and yelling, and he really gets his start, and he really becomes in modern terms, a made man for Fort French as the result of an election day fight in which he absolutely clears the crowd with a couple rocks.
So not only was Tom proficient with his pistols and his rifle, he was proficient with his fists and sandstones as well. One of the things that we do know about Tom is that he worked with the Eversoles to begin with, but he actually stole Joe Eversole's brother-in-law's horse, and they had indicted him for it and planned to see him hanged. So he had some friends testify in court, false testimony, of course, that he had nothing to do with this horse thievery, and when he got off, he then told the Eversoles that he swore and declared that he would see every last one of them leave Perry County or die a bloody death.
Bad Tom Smith did marry. He married a woman by the name of Emmeline Combs, and they called her Millie, and they had several children together.
Emmeline was the daughter of D.Y. Combs, one of the wealthiest men in Hazard. Tom married into influence, money, and great opportunities. But because his wife's family held a close personal and business relationship with the Eversoles, and Tom being a devout French convert, he delivered her a crushing ultimatum. It's either me or them damn Eversoles. Her futile pleas for Tom to make amends with the Eversoles and to stay with she and the children went completely disregarded, as Tom's rash temper and foolish pride would not allow him to be swayed. He left a potentially well-to-do family life for a new life, one filled with whiskey, killing, and bad women.
Tom had an affliction that he termed as the fits, and today we think that it would probably be a type of epilepsy. We're not really certain. When Tom went the medical route and saw some doctors about these fits, they prescribed a drug what we know as laudanum, which was a tincture of opium. And it probably wasn't long until he was just full-blown addicted to that as well as whiskey.
He really was, as most folks said, he was a fox among foxes. He wasn't doing anything that other people weren't doing at that time, but he certainly had the reputation for being rougher. And a lot of that came because of the 1887 murder of Joe Hurt. That really was one of those instances that really brought Bad Tom to the forefront of a life of crime in Eastern Kentucky.
Tom had worked with Joe quite a bit over the years, and they had quite a bit of a relationship there, and I felt like that Tom probably wanted to get him out of the way as him being the, what we would call muscle of the Eversole faction.
And it was one of those things where it was one of Tom's very early murders. So it was done in what we would today call a cowardly way. He was shot from ambush. He was shot and killed. But the Joe Hurt murder really kind of opens the door and really kind of proves to Fort French that Tom Smith is a very serious player in what's happening in Perry County. But even though he was not a true leader, he did rise to a little bit of prominence because of the Joe Hurt murder.
Nicholas Combs was the youngest brother of Judge Josiah Combs, and he was in with the Eversoles as well. I think that he was only 14 when the incident occurred that Tom ended up killing him.
Two of the more publicized murders that Tom actually confessed to committing were quite heinous in nature. Joseph Eversole, the leader of the Eversole faction, and his traveling companion Nicholas Combs were shot in ambush from close range. Eversole was killed immediately by a shot to the head, while the gravely wounded Nick lay motionless in the roadway alongside him. In a final act of insult to the dead, Tom began rifling Eversole's pockets when young Combs came back to consciousness and recognized Tom. He begged him for his life. But Tom stated that he couldn't leave any witnesses and fired a killing shot at point-blank range into the eye of the pleading young teenager. To further symbolize his point concerning eyewitnesses, Tom cocked his pistol and fired another shot into the boy's other eye.
And this is not an ambush murder. This is something that really is a transformational event for Bad Tom, because always to that point he had shot from the woods, he had shot from a position of being ambushed for someone coming along. He would shoot them off their horse. But this is a real change, because this is an up-close, personal murder of someone that he knew, and it was not a long-distance killing. It was right on top of him. He was standing over him when he shot and killed Nick Combs in 1888, and that is really one of those murders that, from there on, it was no holds barred for Bad Tom.
Bad Tom Smith quickly rose to become the principal leader of the French faction through his cold-blooded deeds, and with it came the spoils of battle. But his newfound glory came at a rather haunting expense, quite possibly due to the gruesome murder of Nicholas Combs.
Tom started to have some nightmares and just sleep difficulties following this murder. And I think that had a lot to do with the progression of Tom's nightmares and fits and things that he later became afflicted with so strongly that he just could not rest at all at night.
Another of the horrible crimes that Bad Tom committed and confessed to was the murder of Shade Combs. Shade was shot in front of his children, in front of his house, basically in his own front yard, at his front gate, which is supposed to be, among bad men and thieves, this was supposed to be the only sanctuary. If you were out in public, you were fair game for anything. But there was a real hesitancy by most of these folks to shoot you in front of your children, as Bad Tom simply, not shooting him from ambush, but simply walks up to him and shoots him in front of his family. So those children, the rest of their lives, had to live with that scene, I'm certain, playing over and over and over to their head. The fact that their father was killed right in front of them, the fact that he was shot and died just minutes away as a result of this man, Tom Smith, who was so bold that he simply walked up and put a gun to him.
Bad Tom made good on his promise to Fort French of either seeing the Eversoles leave town or die bloody, as one by one they were either murdered, pulled up stakes, or no longer participated in the political process. The violent Frenchmen had certainly killed more Eversole men than they themselves had lost, as the Eversoles were more inclined to indict and let the legal system take its course, rather than use deadly force themselves. However, one member of the Eversole faction held out and defied Tom's threats to remain in Perry County.
Another of the murders that took place during that time period was the murder of Robin Cornett. Ultimately, Cornett died because he was making money from timber, and Fort French was not getting in on that action. So when it's all ultimately is boiled down to the cause, yeah, Cornett and the Eversoles were related. They were all connected. The Davidsons were also connected. But for Tom, this represented the opportunity to eliminate a huge rival in the timber business for the Fort French faction. The more money the Fort French had, the better Tom lived. The more money that Tom had, the better the women, the better the booze, the better the times that he had. By that point, Tom was in so much trouble with the court system that the summonses were coming to appear, and he was just simply ignoring it. He had threatened to kill county officials. This was really almost the pinnacle of his power in Perry County. And as a result of that, they burned the courthouse.
Inevitably, some heavy indictments were handed down on Tom Smith. Well, he didn't really appreciate that very much. So he came up with the idea that if they don't have any of them there indictments on me, then they ain't got nothing they can do about it, have they? He'd probably discussed this with Fulk French to some length, and Fulk, being the crafty businessman that he was, he probably felt that this was playing right along into his plans as well, that if all the official documents and deeds and things like that were out of the way, then that would make his quest a little easier to achieve.
There was gangs of these outlaws. They really were like the Wild West. They were. And they would do what it took, to survive themselves. But I think poor Bad Tom wanted just to have some fun and drink liquor and stuff, and he didn't. That was just part of it, I guess, killing.
Well, when Tom inevitably made good on his threat that he would see all the Eversoles leave town or be dead, he had pretty much instilled just such a fear into these people that they indeed did pull up and leave. Tom had made some offhand threats toward Judge Randall, who he had appeared before several times in court, and he had actually struck such fear into this hardcore Eastern Kentucky judge that he traveled back and forth from his home dressed as a female. He wore a shawl, a bonnet, whatever he could to disguise himself from this evil threat of Bad Tom Smith.
One of the best known aspects of Bad Tom's life became known throughout history as the Battle of Hazard. The Battle of Hazard is really one of these weird little instances that so many factors came together at one time in one place. It was a long, drawn-out battle where hundreds, possibly thousands of shots were fired in the course of a couple of days, all involving this running battle between folks on the Eversole side and folks on the Fulk French side. Tom was right in the middle of it. Tom was there in front of the courthouse when the first fight broke out. Tom was down in the bar when the fight broke out. Tom seemed to be almost everywhere when trouble started.
Many of the shots fired during the Battle of Hazard were by a drunken Tom Smith himself. He found a unique vantage point high above the city of Hazard in the old Combs Cemetery, and from a covered position in a sunken grave, he rained down fire upon the center of town. The shots volleyed back and forth throughout the night and into the next day. The Eversole men found themselves pinned down in 2 cabins on Main Street. When the smoke had cleared, a man by the name of John McKnight stepped outside to survey the scene, only to be immediately struck in the chest by a bullet from Bad Tom. McKnight fell dead in the cabin's doorway, bringing an end to the Battle of Hazard.
It was a very, very sad day. It was a very horrific battle. And after that, most of the people who lived here started thinking about actually leaving. It was the time when Hazard almost became a ghost town.
That long-running battle, known as the Battle of Hazard, was a couple days of just sheer terror in Hazard, in which people were afraid to even stick their heads out the door. And those that did, like John McKnight, ended up dead.
Immediately following the Battle of Hazard, Tom was indicted for his role in that, and specifically for the murder of John McKnight. And inevitably, Tom was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for this. Tom spent quite a bit of time in jail following this, and French saw that his case would be heard in the Court of Appeals. And the result of that Court of Appeals was that everything had been reversed and that Tom was released, a free man, to resume his normal life. Now, no one really knows why Tom left Hazard and moved down to Jackson. However, it's quite possible that he just felt that his luck was beginning to run out and that he wanted to get away from this image of bad Tom.
In 1893, Tom Smith decided to relocate to the neighboring boomtown of Jackson, which was the economic hub of eastern Kentucky at the time. Jackson was home to the world's largest sawmill, and also where the railroad ended. Tom quickly took a position working for the most powerful and influential man in eastern Kentucky, Judge James Hargis.
When he came to Jackson, he took a job working for Judge Hargis at the Mammoth Department Store. It's the largest department store in all of eastern Kentucky. Now, basically what Tom did for Hargis was just stand around on the street, keep an eye on people, make sure that they were in line.
During his time in Jackson, Tom naturally had his run-ins with the law. Most notably his second cousin, Sheriff Breck Combs, whose family he'd once been placed with as an orphan child. Tom appeared in court one day to answer a breach of peace charge. He had discharged his pistol several times inside a church mid-service. He paid his fine, and upon exiting the courthouse, met a well-to-do lady by the name of Catherine McQuinn. Mrs. McQuinn lived on Smith's branch of South Fork in Breathitt County, about 6 miles outside of Jackson. Her house was well known to be a party place and was commonly referred to as the Cat House. Tom and Catherine, or Cat as she was affectionately known about the area, had many good times there, and as a result, it led to the evening of February 5th, 1895, on which the mysterious murder of Dr. John E. Rader occurred.
At least one account says that the night that he was killed, that Dr. Rader, Bad Tom, and Catherine McQuinn were all in the bed together at the time of the murder. That something occurred, and Tom Smith got up out of the bed and shot in through the covers, in through the sheets, and hit Dr. Rader, basically killing him in the bed. He bled to death there in the bed. There are other accounts that say that Bad Tom was suffering seizures, and they called Dr. Rader to come with his little black doctor's bag, and that he had treated Tom, and Tom had gone to sleep, and as a result, Dr. Rader sat at the foot of the bed, the dutiful doctor, and that Catherine came to Tom during the night and said, Dr. Rader is trying to kill you. He's trying to overdose you with morphine. And as a result, Tom got up and shot Dr. Rader in the rocking chair at the end of the bed. Based upon the evidence presented at trial, there were holes in the sheets. So the rocking chair story that becomes prominent after the murder doesn't hold as much weight as the three in the bed story does.
Nobody really knows what happened that night. However, the next morning, the police had been called. The sheriff came out to the McQuinn place and found Tom sitting on the porch, rolling himself a cigarette, in a very calm manner. Breck asked Tom, what happened? Tom says, I don't know, I was drunk. I really don't know what happened. Well, inevitably, Tom and Mrs. McQuinn were arrested. And Tom thought that, well, I've got this beat. I've gotten out of everything up until this point. I've got friends in high places. However, what he didn't really know was that the doctor had friends in even higher places.
At some point, they make the decision that Tom is going to be an exception to the Breathitt County rule, to the Eastern Kentucky rule, to be honest, that they're going to prosecute the case. A lot of that decision was made by Judge Higgins, John Wise Higgins, who was a Republican. So you have several things playing into why did Tom Smith, why was he prosecuted when so many murders in Breathitt County had gone unprosecuted? And they really want to use Tom as an example. And that's what it really boils down to. They want to use Tom as an example. This is their opportunity. It's one of these easy cases that is not that difficult to prosecute. So they see this young boy who's orphaned, who has abandoned his wife, who's taken up with Catherine McQuinn. There's really no, in many of their eyes, there was no redeeming value to Tom Smith. He has a long reputation as being a bad man. So at some point they make the decision that if we prosecute and execute Tom, that this will be a great example to the other people in Eastern Kentucky, that they will see we mean business. There's not all of this feuding and killing and murders are going to stop because they know we're absolutely going to do this to the next person.
The trial of Bad Tom Smith was an unprecedented event for the people of eastern Kentucky and rapidly became a national sensation. The murder of Dr. Rader was covered by many major newspapers across the country. It was a very quick trial, as Circuit Judge D.B. Redwine didn't believe in long drawn-out legal affairs. Few witnesses showed up, and the trial lasted only a few days. Catherine McQuinn was convicted of conspiracy and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Tom Smith was found guilty of murder. The jury deliberated for only 2 minutes. He was soon after sentenced to the ultimate penalty of death by hanging. Up until that point, there had never been a legal execution in Breathitt County.
They sentenced him to be executed. That had never occurred in Breathitt County's history before that point, and it has never occurred since then that anyone would be executed in Jackson itself. So Bad Tom becomes the first and only legal hanging to take place in Breathitt County.
Following the murder of Dr. John E. Rader, Bad Tom Smith is quickly tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang for his reprehensible crime.
The murder occurred in February, and Tom was sentenced to be hanged by June. Well, there was a public outrage that, why are we waiting so long to get rid of this guy? These days it would be tied up in court for years on top of years. But there was a public outrage that they had to wait 4 whole months to see justice served.
The hanging took place on June 28, 1895, and it was a well-publicized event. It had run in all of the papers. They ran special trains to bring people to Jackson. All of these trains kept coming, dropping off people. The crowd estimates vary. Some say as high as 15 to 20,000. Probably more accurately, 5 to 7 is what actually came to Jackson that day. But for a little mountain town with no major industry, that was a huge influx of people. And they all gathered around the scaffold that had been built behind the courthouse with the anticipation that the execution would take place early that morning around 11 o'clock. But because of some difficulties with the telegraph line, it didn't take place until later in the afternoon at 1. So you have 7,000, 8,000 people, whatever was here, standing around, having to find food, trying to find shade as the temperature rose up into the 90s. There were lots of people who hadn't eaten at all that day, but they refused to leave their spots because they wouldn't get a view of the execution.
And I could not even envision that many people in the little town of Jackson, like 5,000 people came to this hanging, and they all rode wagons and brought in their, food supplies or baskets for the food that day. And of course, it would probably be, people were probably hanging from balconies, probably hanging out of the trees watching this stuff, and children running around playing, shooting marbles. I mean, it was just a big social event.
The morning of Tom's execution was well choreographed. They called in extra guards. They had people placed on the tops of the courthouse. And at some point, Tom had asked to be baptized. There was always this hope in Tom that Fulton French and all of his supporters would be able to pull off a last-second reprieve from the governor. Governor John Y. Brown, however, had other ideas. They had sent very early that morning, a request to the governor. The governor's reply had not been received. So Sheriff Combs had planned the execution to go on early that morning, around 11 o'clock. But because the governor's reply hadn't been received, and because a tree had fallen across the telegraph lines, they decided to move that back to 1 o'clock. So Sheriff Combs went out, climbed the scaffold, and announced to the crowd that the execution would not take place, but that it would take place later in the afternoon, not when they had scheduled. That morning, several ministers came to speak with Tom. Reverend Kelly came, and Dr. Dickey was there. Stephen Carpenter was there. Several ministers had come frequently to visit with Bad Tom in his cell. So we know a lot about what went on in that particular cell. They decide that they are going to take him to the river and baptize him. So without any announcement of a certain time of the baptism, because there was always a fear that because Fulton French was in town, that some of his men would rush and try to get Tom out of prison or out of jail at the moment that they opened the door to take him to the scaffold. And the rumors had circulated that there was going to be a shootout and that they were going to get Tom and that all of his supporters were going to take him. So without announcing it, they simply stepped out of the jail, took him down what was Academy Street, or today College Avenue, down to the river. They very quickly waded out into the river, Reverend Carpenter, Reverend Kelly, and they baptized him. They brought him back up very quickly and put him back in the jail.
All of the people that were there were just amazed that this bad Tom Smith that everybody had heard about had requested to be baptized. A lot of them made their way down to the riverbank to witness it. No less than 3 preachers active in the baptism, and reportedly up to a dozen more lined up along the riverbank, preaching in unison. So quite possibly a dozen to 15 preachers to baptize one man. Maybe they felt that his reputation had preceded him so much so that it would take a dozen or more to preach him into heaven.
But for the most part, that morning was spent very quietly. He sang a few songs, he ate, he was baptized, and then he sat quietly by himself for most of the morning with his head in his hands. For Tom, the bad news came very soon that morning. They had delayed the execution. They had sent the telegraph asking Governor John Y. Brown to intervene, to give him a pardon, to give him another opportunity. And his reply came, and Sheriff Combs delivered that to the jail. And it was very simple. It said, "I refuse to interfere with mountain politics."
Well, when Tom got this message back, he could pretty much resign himself that his fate was sealed, and that he would have to go ahead and take the gallows. So he asked Sheriff Combs that, if at all possible, that he would give him as much time as he could to say his piece before the crowd.
At about 1 o'clock that afternoon, Sheriff Combs goes to the cell and he gets Bad Tom up and prepares him. Tom, of course, even to the end, Sheriff Combs says that Tom made sure that he was in proper attire, that he went to the scaffold in a clean suit. Even to the end, he was the dandy. They open the side door of the jail, and Tom steps out into the sunlight. And we have an account by a lady who said that when he stepped out, he was as white as an angel, that he was the most beautiful man that she had ever seen, that he had been inside and didn't have sun, so he had turned white. And when he steps out, the sunlight, of course, we know was directly in his eyes that afternoon. And he squinted to see the crowd. And we can only imagine what went through his mind when he looked out over all of these people. The guards come out first, and he steps out on the top step. And the newspaper accounts say that there was an audible gasp, at which the crowd realized that it was time. It was time. They let him down through. They had moved the crowd back away from the scaffold because of the fear of the escape attempt. And they led him up the steps of the scaffold, 13 steps to the top. Dignitaries, the ministers, and Sheriff Combs are all on top of the scaffold. And they quiet the crowd. Didn't have to do much. It was already pretty much, they were hanging on every single word, every single sound.
Upon taking the scaffold, Tom gave a full confession in his own words. To clear up previously reported inaccuracies, Tom spoke directly to the gathered newspapermen and the crowd. Despite his lack of a formal education, it was remarked that he possessed quite the eloquent speaking voice. Feeling he had nothing left to lose, he confessed to the murders that he had truly committed and denounced all other misdeeds that had been wrongly laid at his feet due to the notoriety of his reputation.
And I honestly believe that he told everything that he had done. I don't think he held anything back, because there are details that he gave that only he could have known in many of those instances. Only the murderer could have known. But he had lived with all of those things for such a long, long time. Differing newspaper accounts talk about him waking up at night screaming, that there were ghosts in the cell with him, that the Combses had come back and had spent time with him. So this is a troubled man who is living with what he has done. And that scaffold meant the opportunity to take that final burden away. And I think that's what he did.
An intriguing statement that Tom made while on the scaffold was that he had acted alone in the murder of Dr. Rader, and that Catherine McQuinn was totally innocent of any wrongdoing. which leaves us two ways to examine this statement. Either Tom was telling the truth, as he had no reason to lie and had nothing left to hide, or he was saying what he felt he needed to say to get his girlfriend Kat released from prison.
But regardless, what he said on the scaffold worked. J.B. Markham, Judge Redwine, all of the people involved in Catherine's trial wrote to the governor. They were successful in convincing the governor to release Catherine McQuinn because Tom said on the stand, I did it alone. She had nothing to do with it. So it worked. So was it a man in love with a woman and his last act of kindness for her, or was it simply the truth? We may never know.
And they sang some hymns and did a little bit of preaching, and Tom did some praying, and of course he gave that famous speech, "Don't be like me."
Upon completing his confession, Tom felt the call to address the crowd as a whole. In a clear musical voice, he gave this legendary speech. Friends, one and all, I want to talk to you a little before I die. My last words on earth to you are to take warning from my fate. Bad whiskey and bad women have brought me to where I am. I hope you ladies will take no umbrage at this, for I have told you the God's truth. To you little children who were the first to be blessed by Jesus, I will give this warning. Don't drink whiskey and don't do as I have done. I want everybody in this vast crowd who does not wish to do the things that I have done and to put themselves in the place that I now occupy to hold up their hands. As he said this, the hand of every person in that captivated audience was held aloft. That is beautiful. It looks like what I shall see in heaven. Again, I say to you, take warning from my fate and live better lives than I have lived. I die with no hard feelings toward anybody. There ain't a soul in the world that I hate. I love everybody. Farewell until we meet again.
After about 45 minutes of the proceedings, the sheriff said it's time. Tom didn't offer any resistance. He stood there and he let them shackle him. He was quiet. And they placed the bag over his head, put the noose around his neck, and as they were ready to pull that lever, he screamed out in the most blood-curdling voice that people state they had ever heard, "Save me, oh God, please save me." And they dropped him to his death, and that was the end of Bad Tom Smith.
The scene around the scaffold at the moment of execution would have been something spectacular to see, I think, because you had gathered at that moment in Eastern Kentucky history the most powerful people who would influence the next 75 to 100 years in Breathitt County and Eastern Kentucky history. Throughout the crowd, you had all kinds of folks that had come to watch. They had just heard this long confession by Bad Tom, and by every single account, they had pressed in so tight that his words had moved the crowd so much. They were so powerful to hear this man who's about to die say, "I've done things wrong," that the tears were just flowing in the crowd. People were crying, that there were audible sobs that were heard by people who were just overcome by what Tom had said. And by all accounts, he was an eloquent speaker. We know that he was a songwriter. We know that he had a way with words. Was very smooth, especially with the ladies. But here he is speaking in his last days about do the right thing, choose the right path. In the crowd to hear that were a wide variety of people that would change Eastern Kentucky. His wife had come. She's sitting in the second floor of the courthouse. She has a view of his actual execution. His children are there. His sister, his brother, all kinds of relatives that come down from Knott County. They were here. Dr. Rader, Armand, his wife, Armand, was in the crowd. Their children were there. You had on the porch of the Sewell boarding house the elite of Breathitt County, Judge Hargis, George Washington Sewell. You had in the crowd Jess Fields. You had in the crowd J.B. Markham. You had all of the names that would play into Tom White, Curtis Jedd, into the later feuds in Breathitt County were there. This event was put on so that those people would understand that this is what was waiting for people who involved in this type of crime, this type of violence. So here they are witnessing the execution that was supposed to teach them a lesson. And within about 5 years, there would be a scene in Breathitt County, violence in Breathitt County that was unheard of. So Bad Tom's use of an execution, his execution as an example, ended up being nothing for the people other than entertainment.
And hanging of Bad Tom Smith has always been just, I don't know, just close to my heart for some reason. I wasn't there, but I could feel that man, his heart, how he felt, and he dearly showed that he had changed, that he knew that he was going to die and he was going to have to meet his maker, and so he got forgiven. I totally think that, and was a changed man.
The execution occurs. The crowd is beginning to kind of mill away and to go back to the places that they need to go to get on the trains. They're pulling people out of the crowd. The body is allowed to hang there until they're sufficiently satisfied that he is dead. But he's put in the coffin. He's put in the back of a wagon. And what follows is this long progression of people who get in line behind this wagon loaded with Tom Smith's body. And this procession from there goes up, across, into Troublesome Creek, up Troublesome Creek, crosses into, ultimately to the home of James Stacy at Vico. Where is Bad Tom today? That's one of the greatest questions out there. By all accounts, he was buried in a cemetery near the home of James Stacy. That would put it in a couple different locations. There are several cemeteries there. Tradition holds that he was buried with the rest of the Smiths and his family. That cemetery was ultimately removed during the construction of Carfork Lake and moved to what's now called the Carfork Memorial Cemetery.
Many of those that were in that cemetery where we believe Tom was actually buried on Carr Creek in Knott County, this was the section of that cemetery that was later moved to the Carr Creek Memorial Cemetery. And among the gravestones here, there are a lot of unmarked. And we honestly believe that stones like the ones up here are probably the final resting place of Bad Tom. But during that time period, there was a tendency for a lot of folks to break the tombstones, chip off pieces of it so that they would have souvenirs. And that's one of the theories as to why Bad Tom didn't have a truly marked grave. But as you can see, there were so many just unmarked tombstones in that cemetery. There are just so many that we honestly don't know who they are. Could be Bad Tom, any one of these, but certainly he's buried among all of the family and friends that are in this neighborhood.
The other legend is that Tom Smith was buried at the Vico Church, the church there right downtown in the city of Vico.
Exactly Bad Tom is buried is a point of debate. Today there is a tombstone here at the Vico Baptist Church that purports to be the final resting place of Bad Tom Smith, but it's one of those great debates in the Tom Smith legend. Is he here? Is he buried on in Knott County and today at the Carr Creek Memorial Cemetery? No one can really say. And they engraved upon it kind of an appropriate saying. It says, bad enough to be hanged, not too bad for God to save. Kind of an interesting saying that the Smith family decided to put on there. And it does memorialize the fact that in his last days he realized that he needed to turn away from the way that he was and turn toward God.
We remember him by the stone that was placed on the grave at Vico, but to say positively that's his grave, I don't think anyone can do that.
The story of Bad Tom Smith is certainly a compelling and sensational tale. A poor orphan boy who rose to captain a feudal faction and whose affinity for whiskey and bad women led him from a path of damnation inevitably onto the blissful road of salvation. The media of the day painted him as Bad Tom Smith, a vicious gun for hire who ran roughshod over the small towns of eastern Kentucky. But in the end, he renounced his ill-gotten moniker with hopes of being remembered in the pages of history as simply Thomas Smith. Bad enough to be hanged, not too bad for God to save.
Sun up on Jackson Square, Judge Parker calls for prayer. A hush came down like water as old Tom's words filled the air. Take warning from my fate, if you judge me, be damned. Bad whiskey and bad down from Ousley County. Bring 'em down from Nottely. Bring 'em out to mines and hazard. Man's one chance to see.